Welcome to this bonus edition of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, as well as YouTube and some other various places on the internet. We shall be hiding it, as well as BCTV. I'm your host, Olga Peters. Welcome, Emilie Kornheiser, representative for Brattleboro. How are you doing?
I am doing well today, Olga. Thank you. I am settling into some strange new rhythm. And yeah, feeling like there's some possibility in all of this confusion.
I have to say, the only time Emilie and I are seeing each other is, basically over these video chats recently. And I have to say, your very pretty kind of ethereal outfit today is much more uplifted than the heavier, but very nice outfits you've been wearing in our previous chats.
No, I'm feeling the possibilities this today. We're seeing a lot of opportunities for policy change. We're seeing a lot of possibilities for social change.
Isn't that exciting?
It is exciting.
I'm really curious to see, for years we've had conversations in Vermont about affordability. And I think what I find is not everyone's definition of affordability is the same thing, especially the governors.
We've talked about that a lot. Yes.
Yes, we have. And I'm just really curious to see how that word and the definitions attached to it and the policies attached to it change.
Yes.
After COVID. That's kind of a benchmark I'm going to be using for marking things.
Absolutely. I mean, it's possible this will be the benchmark of our entire lives, to be perfectly honest, certainly, some of our children's lives.
I know we thought the 2008 Great Recession was a biggie.
Yeah. No.
This feels bigger.
It does feel bigger on a lot of different levels. And one piece, and we've talked on previous episodes about how this has helped sort of illuminate some existing cracks in the system.
Yes.
Or challenges in our communities or however we want to phrase that. And I think one of them is our dependence on a tourist economy.
Yes.
And the fact that Vermont has fashioned itself for, I think, more than 100 years as a apocalypse refuge.
Yeah, I don't know that is the exact word all the marketers would use.
Probably I shouldn't have even said it, but
I liked it though. I liked it because even like back in the grand old days when people would summer elsewhere, I remember reading all these stories about artists who would come up to Vermont to take the air.
Yeah, that's what Madame Cherise was, right?
Exactly. And so still that idea that it's the healthy place to get away to. But it also means the flip side of that is it's not necessarily a place, I think sometimes in the minds of visitors where real people live.
Absolutely. And so when I think about, I think there's a lot of people who moved here in the 60s and 70s for the sort of promise of a new beginning and the opportunity to craft a new life. I think about sort of, the first stage of colonialism here, when white people came to create a new beginning and wiped out an existing population. And, I think a lot of people who came here, whether that was in that sort of first colonial expansion or, many that followed, or the 60s and 70s, some people did it out of sort of this dream and this new hope and this creativity. And some folks did it out of like real fear and desperation from what they were escaping, right? Whether that was fear and desperation about what was happening in America or fear and desperation from what they were facing in cities, whether that was illness or economic struggles or social struggles. That's been, those are sort of the two reasons that people have immigrated throughout the world for all these years. And Vermont has really, that's how Vermont has become Vermont. And so on those historical waves, the way that exists, and Vermonters, people who are already in Vermont, have pushed back against that in various ways, right? And I think, even the Take Back Vermont reaction to civil unions was part of that historic thread, and we've talked about that
Mm.
a little bit. But
Yeah,
definitely,
that one's interesting because those signs were actually, if I remember correctly, created by a group outside the state.
oh,
But people in the state adopted it and put them
yes,
up.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Similar "Don't New York my gun" laws. We've talked about
mhm,
that. And so this idea of sort of the outside invader and protecting ourselves from the outside invader is really always constantly being balanced in Vermont by the fact that our economy and our need for new folks and new energy and supporting the arts and all of these things is really sustained by this sort of, bucolic dream of Vermont as this clean, healthy, safe place full of wonder and opportunity. And right now we're really seeing a magnification of that with
mhm.
folks from other states coming here to their second homes, coming here to vacation homes, and really reckoning with how we handle that as a community.
Yeah, it's interesting because what for me as someone who grew up in a resort town,
Mm,
and my father had a inn and restaurant, so definitely part of the tourist industry, my stepfather. And then of course I worked at gift shops, all through college and helped put my way through college. It's this interesting tension of resources, of being grateful for this influx of money, because let's face it, Vermont doesn't have a lot of its own,
mhm,
but also some classism
mhm,
and being economically a second class citizen. At least it felt that way in your own home.
mhm,
And I think that is that question of resources,
mhm,
that, or I shouldn't say question, that fear over resources
mhm,
is what's really being highlighted here.
mhm,
And I feel the state has a lot to answer for with its tourist industry.
mhm,
Um, in so many ways. One, because I think it doesn't question it very often
mhm,
because it's such a cash cow as far as
mhm.
taxes goes.
Yeah.
And yet for people living on the ground, whether you are, working in the tourist industry, or if you're a tourist or a second homeowner
Mhm,
who's expected to pay really high taxes
mhm,
for a second home, that reality on the ground is not necessarily the same.
mhm.
Um,
And,
and
even when I had first moved here, so fresh out of New York myself, more than 20 years ago, and was waiting tables, and the way people treated me, as if I was a second class citizen. And then when they realized that I was a college student from New York, how visible their shift was in perception made me really immediately aware of this incredible bias that was shown towards Vermonters by people from out of state. Whereas I don't know if I would have been able to recognize that if I hadn't actually seen that switch go off, that flip when they realized who I really was. Um,
mhm.
and so that's been sort of something I've carried with me in all of these years that I've been living here, whether that was working in the service economy or policy making. And in the legislature, when we look at issues around the tourism economy, I've often asked, can we please get explicit as we're having this conversation about what value this brings to our communities beyond
Mm,
revenue? And not
yes.
saying, revenue is very important. I'm not saying it isn't. And the property tax that second homeowners pay is incredibly important to support our school system. Um, the revenue that comes in terms of sort of meals and rooms tax and sales tax, also very important for sustaining other services we provide. Um, but I think it's also important to look at sort of what wages those jobs pay, and then what resources are not available because those resources are sort of going towards supporting and investing, continuing to invest in a tourist economy.
Mhm.
So Vermont's finding itself at this particular crossroads right now, as we're seeing folks coming in from out of state to be somewhere that feels sort of safer and warmer and airier than a crowded city. Where, for me, the idea of being in an apartment in Manhattan with my family, knowing that, there are EMS who can't respond to calls because they're flooded, knowing that the hospitals might not have a spot for me and my family, knowing that probably the person delivering my groceries is infected because they have been on the front lines more than anyone without proper protection is, I mean,
It's terrifying.
it's terrifying. And so I have so much empathy for folks who are showing up here.
Yeah.
And so I was really excited to see that as Vermonters were getting more and more escalated about folks who were showing up here, we're beginning to see some real guidance around what does it mean to be someone who crosses the border into Vermont and says, you know, I need respite. I'm here for respite. What are my obligations to you because I've now joined your community? So how do we start that conversation, right?
Yes. And just to put some things into context, you know, part of what is at the crux again of this conversation is resources, because as Laura Sibilia noted in one of her email newsletters that she sends out every week, there are some resort towns where the number of second homes, it's like 4-to-1 ratio between second homes and year-round residents. And what that happens if all those second homes are filled at once, and just for the sake of argument, let's say everyone there needs medical care, that's a very different planning structure than planning for the year-round population. Now suddenly, do we have enough hospital beds? Do we have enough protective gear? Do we have enough whatever people need to be cared for if they're sick?
And I want to really highlight those are important questions to ask. And we didn't just start asking them this week.
No.
Those questions were questions that, you know, I asked, and I know a number of other legislators were asking weeks ago when we were really starting planning for this pandemic. And so a lot of our emergency planning processes have taken into account a population that looks more like summer or the height of ski season than just, you know, year-round residents. And so I don't want to fan the flames of fear by sort of not being explicit about the fact that we do actually have a lot of resources here. You know, a lot of our general stores are still open because second homeowners shop at them. Or, you know, Brattleboro Food Co-op certainly would not probably be able to sustain itself at the scale it does without, you know, folks coming from out of state to shop there. And so a lot of our systems are already set up for that level of patronage or customer base. And so
that's good, because you know what? Here's just a little FYI from the reporters side of the microphone.
Please.
When I have listened to press conferences with the governor, and maybe I missed one and this was mentioned, so I totally admit that I could have missed something. But when reporters have asked the question, do we have to worry about the extra population overwhelming our medical system? The answer is basically, don't worry about it. We're Vermonters, we take care of everybody. But no one has explicitly said, here's the planning or questions that have gone in. So in many ways, those reporters weren't actually getting their questions answered.
Yeah. Well,
and if a reporter's not getting their question answered, one more thing, then that means the community's not getting their questions answered.
Yes. And I think that often when folks are talking to reporters, they forget that in avoiding a question, they're not just avoiding a reporter, they're avoiding a question that many other people have as well.
Yeah.
So I think part of the challenge there is that, well, I don't think that we are facing grocery shortages anytime soon beyond sort of the repercussions of hoarding behaviors, which we've talked about before, and should, as we all calm down with our buying and take some deep breaths, should really like iron themselves out. Because we are still receiving food into the state at the same quantity and speed that we did before. Our medical system is still fragile in the best of times. So yes, while planning is taking into consideration the fact that we have a, you know, sort of varying population size, that doesn't mean that we could, you know, we have a hospital system that can handle everyone getting COVID simultaneously, right? There isn't a state in the country that can handle that.
No.
New York City, with its huge population, can't handle that. And our
As we're
emergency
seeing.
medical system, our emergency medical services, like ambulance services, were certainly struggling significantly before we even got to this point. And so what we need to do in order to make sure that we have the health system to sustain the level of illness that we think we're going to see from this is to flatten the curve, to disperse it enough that the existing resources can meet the need. And so as second homeowners come in, as other folks from out of state come in, making sure that as a community, we're bringing them into the fold enough that they understand what we're doing here, that they understand how we're working to flatten the curve, that they understand the kind of social distancing measures we put in place, that they understand how we've decided to be safe in a grocery store. Because, and we've talked about this so much, Olga, so much of what Vermonters do is implicit, like, right? Like, we don't have real road signs. We don't often have, signs for the best way to use a park. Finding the farm stand, or knowing how the farm stand operates and where the quarters go and where the dollars go and all of it is something that, one person tells another. It's not something
Right.
that is explicit. And so as new people come here seeking respite and sanctuary, how are we making sure that they're joining our community norms so that we can all be safe together?
Yes.
That's, for me, the most important value in this. Because if we start saying, like, all the people from out of state need to stay away and they're the enemy and they're the ones bringing the infection, my first thought is like, okay, the moment we start blaming the Jews for the blaming New Yorkers for the infection, I feel like the next step was we're going to start blaming the Jews, because that's where I come from with my own family history. And then the other part of it that gets really scary for me is that we stop taking responsibility for our own behaviors and our own actions and our own policy and what our own policy needs to do. And then there's also, like, I have a constituent whose mom lives in Massachusetts, and like at some point she's 90, she's probably gonna need to bring her mom to her house. And so many of us who live here have moved here from out of state and have deep family connections, in other places. So if we're going to be, isolated, maybe some people need to be isolated with their families and their loved ones that they need to care for. So really recognizing that our boundaries are not as tidy as we think they are, even though, the billboards disappear, but the edge between Vermont and Massachusetts is not really all that clear.
Right.
Otherwise, in terms of where humans are living. Sorry, that was a long lecture.
No, that was a good lecture, though, because, I think as we're talking, one of the cracks in our system that this crisis is illuminating is our fears, and fears that we've been holding for a long time.
Yeah.
And which means those fears aren't being answered. And they're also, I think, something that to me is a very American thing. There's so many beautiful things about America. I love our optimism. I don't love our habit of blaming the other.
Yeah.
And if there's no other to blame, we'll find one. And I think that's the other crack in our system that is being illuminated right now. Because when it comes to something like a pandemic or a virus, there really aren't enemies. A virus does not care who you are, how old you are, where you're from. It's just like, can I get you infected? Here we go. That's what a virus wants to do. And so this is a perfect time for us to practice community, actually.
Absolutely. But those fears that I don't think we've ever spent enough time addressing as communities, around the fact that many of us feel like folks who come here as tourists or visitors don't see us as fully human and fully integrated members of our own, having our own communities, our own cultures up here. It seems that if you're holding on to that fear, then it would seem very natural that you would assume that those people also wouldn't care about your health and your health needs, right? And so those fears are really founded. And we need to move past them because we are really all in this together. I am excited about some of the sort of clear guidance that has been, that was offered from the governor today. And one of them is just real clarity that people who are coming here from out of state need to spend 2 weeks quarantining, which is really helpful. And sort of, I think many of us have known that if we are coming back from somewhere, we need to spend 2 weeks quarantining, or if we've, been around or exposed, we need to spend 2 weeks quarantining. And then other pieces of that are being really clear that hotels and motels cannot house people who are not already sort of part of an essential person system, whether that's health workers from out of state. And we do have a lot of health workers who are here from out of state.
We have a lot of traveling nurses and such,
right?
yes.
And so just because you see an out of state license plate does not mean that someone is here on vacation. And so also we have a lot of people who are precariously housed who have now been housed in motels and hotels so that they have somewhere safe to be sleeping and isolating themselves.
Yes.
Socially distancing themselves. And so really appreciate the differentiation between sort of what the uses of motels and hotels are right now. The second piece that I think is really important is being really, really clear with Airbnb and short-term rental platforms, because one of the challenges with such a diffuse and unregulated system is that it's really hard to get in touch with each host and say, hey, here's this new law, here's this new rule, right? Because it's up to each person to pay attention. And a lot of people are doing this in the edges of their free time. And so my understanding is that there's been a lot of efforts to get in touch with the actual platform itself, the software itself.
That's what I understand,
and to put up warnings. And yet it's been very hard to get any responsiveness from this very diffuse software network. And so from my perspective, the closer we come into regulatory frameworks and relationships with companies that have this much sort of power over our and within our economy and our lives, the more responsive those platforms will be to the kinds of like really immediate changes and shifts that we needed to see around short-term rentals just being, shut down for a short period of time.
So going back to communicating and creating, because right now I would say in so many ways, the relationship between, for lack of a better term, tourists and year-round residents, in so many ways is very disrespectful. One side's not treating someone as human, the other side's just treating them as a cash cow. So how do we start communicating and welcoming someone into our community, even if we are afraid that they won't respect us?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the question. I mean, maybe that's the next marketing phase, is not something like Love Brattleboro, which is a great marketing campaign from what I hear, but maybe there needs to be a new marketing campaign.
So come actually be of us or with us or something like that. So, I know we've talked about putting up, the highway signs that say, that are reminding people about social norms, like, hey, you show up, social distance, quarantine, whatever it is, right? Being really explicit with people. And then other parts of it are, during different times, what's really important to me is when I see someone sort of looking a little bit lost in the street or in the grocery store, wherever it is, really talk to them the way I would talk to another, someone else that I know, and say like, hey, what are you looking for? You need, but like really being clear that like, I'm a person, I live here, I'm not a tour guide. And these are also real people. And so being like continually engaging in that way, I think is really, really important, because it's really easy to be like, I'm going to ignore all these people who are ignoring me. And I remember when I first moved here and people would like smile at me on the street, and it was so disorienting. And then after a little while, I got used to it. Now I do it. So just holding people to the community values that we're all living by. So not exempting them, and also not blaming them when they don't know, our special New England ways.
Right. Well, because that's the thing about different cultures, whether it's Vermont and another state or another country or what have you is we always believe that the culture we're living in is the quote unquote normal one.
Yes.
And so two people across a cultural divide both deciding that they're the normal ones.
Yeah, totally. And so like when people from out of, people who are coming here fresh from somewhere else and are, seeking sanctuary, how do we say like, hey, you can't hoard toilet paper either, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I really appreciate you sharing these thoughts, Emilie, because I admit at times I still, even though I am now in my 40s
mhm.
and have a job and have traveled overseas and lived overseas, I still hold a lot of anger
Yeah.
towards the tourist industry. Because for my experience I've seen that shift too, where someone thought I was like them and then realized I was just the townie or just the woodchuck or just the hill
Mhm.
kid.
Yeah.
Um, and so I really appreciate you sharing your experience,
Hmm.
because it reminds me that, yeah, this is messed up.
It is messed up. It's messed up. And like we all have moving here for whatever reason, I realized early on that it was not my job to recreate Vermont in my image. It was my responsibility to, observe and learn and adapt and join with my own flavor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anyone's ever going to think I'm a New Englander, but and so I think that's an important balance to strike, that we
Mm-hmm.
are all richer for diversity.
Yes.
And it's okay to hold people accountable to what's best for the community sometimes. And what's best for the community right now is that people share resources and that people keep themselves as socially distant as they can, and that people who are like our essential frontline workers, whether that's working in a grocery store or working in a childcare facility or working in a hospital, that those folks are getting the respect and consideration that they need. And one of those pieces of respect and consideration is that we don't take undue risks that will then cause them undue risks, right?
Yes.
And that means financially supporting, as a community and as a state and as a country, that we are financially supporting the people who have had to leave the workforce in order to keep the rest of us safe.
Yes. And when we are dealing with folks, as simple as it sounds, please and thank you is even more important now than any other day, because we are stressed and we need to extend just a little bit more kindness
Yep.
to one another.
Yeah.
Well, Emilie, thank you. That's about all the time we have for this bonus episode. But I'm sure we will be back later this week as more things evolve with COVID. And of course, you can always find us Friday at 2 p.m. on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro and our SoundCloud page, the Vermontitude SoundCloud page. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.